Hello, my name is Sarah Schaefer, and I'm an assistant professor in the art history department at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I'm here with two graduate students. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
I am Joshua, grad student at UWM in art history. I research Confederate monuments and performances surrounding their unveilings. I'm also a huge fantasy nerd, so excited to be here today.
Right?
Yeah, I'm Hannah Rillie. I am also a master's student at UWM. My thesis and like my research is on Luristan bronzes, which is a province in Iran around the late first millennium BCE. So kind of got the ancient part going on. And
Excellent.
yeah, I've for Game of Thrones, I've been a fan since like high school, so it's been around for a while.
Excellent. Yeah, so we're here to talk about Game of Thrones, and I want to start off with a few kind of notes and disclaimers before we get into things, and talk a little bit more about the show, the books, our relationship to all of those, whatever. First of all, this is not aiming towards any kind of comprehensiveness. This is just kind of a casual conversation about a show that ended, what, 2 years ago now, and books that maybe will never be finished. Who
Likely,
knows? Yeah.
likely never finished.
So we're just kind of gonna talk about some parallels and things that interest us as art historians, people who are interested in art and history. We're going to be talking about the show primarily. I'm sure the books will come up in some capacity, but since we have more visual material to deal with through the shows, that really will be what we're talking about. And I also want to assert that we're not going to be suggesting that the show's creators or that George R.R. Martin, the author of the books, we're trying to make direct connections between this secondary world, this creative world of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, the show, and actual historical geographical context. Now, there are some concrete connections, and we'll talk about those a little bit, but these are creative works. They have parallels with history and certain geographical context, but we're not trying to suggest like this place is supposed to be this other place in reality in time. So we're just going to talk about some parallels that we find interesting and productive. So I'll just start. I've read all the books. I actually like the show more than I like the books. And I won't go into why, but I'm more familiar with the show than I am with the books. But I have read the books. How about you, Joshua?
I read the books a long time ago, about 15 years ago when I was in high school. I read the first three, and then I read Feast for Crows. I haven't actually read anything after Feast for Crows. I've stopped at Feast for Crows.
Which book is that?
That's the fourth book.
Which does not align to the fourth season. What's going on in that one?
Yeah, Feast for Crows is it aligns more with the like third season.
Okay.
The show. I'm trying to remember which season actually. Like,
sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot with
no,
that.
the continuity is kind of off on the show. But A Feast for Crows, I'm pretty sure, is the one where John crosses the wall.
Okay.
For the first time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I could be wrong though. I might be combining two books in my head, but
yeah.
I like the show more as well. But I'm also just like I'm a big fantasy nerd. I play Dungeons and Dragons every Friday. This is my cup of tea.
Excellent. How about you, Hannah? Anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I've only read the first book. I read the first book and maybe like a fourth of the second book, and then I just like stopped reading them.
Yeah.
And I've seen the whole show. I was very on top of it. But but I'm also very bad at like remembering where things have, like, what season, like where those ended off. So I'm very good at plot point. Like I'm better at plot points than saying, oh, that's season 2. Like
Mhm.
that just everything just kind of blurs in my brain.
I get that.
Yeah, especially since, I feel like because the first season is so consistent with the first book, like
So consistent.
it's a little easier to follow in that way. But after that point, and especially once they get into material that goes beyond the books, yeah, it's all kind of a blur. And again, I mean, I rewatched it, I think, a year ago, or sometime during the pandemic. So I've watched it somewhat recently, but still, it all blurs together.
Yeah, I watched all the penultimate episodes before this. So
Which is an
uh,
interesting strategy, and I
I
like it.
my feeling is that the penultimate episode is always the best episode of the
Mhm.
season in the Game of Thrones series. And there's a lot of good stuff in those episodes.
Mhm. Battle of the
Battle,
Bastards is penultimate, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's penultimate. And there's uh oh, the one with the scorpion is also penultimate. The one where uh Dane goes and starts dragon firing all of the people. Which house
Right,
were they
right,
outside of? It's Jamie Lannister's army, but I forget the name of the Lannister house that's there.
Oh,
right.
Casterly Rock.
Casterly Rock, yeah,
Yep,
when they're
yep,
at
yep,
Casterly Rock, yeah.
yep.
Mhm. Yeah, to prepare for this, I watched the season recap videos that HBO's put out. So
Well
Excellent.
done.
Yeah. So this is the map of Westeros as it appears in the books. And often when uh, so Joshua is currently my TA for my teaching assistant for Art History 102, Renaissance to Modern Art and Architecture, and Hannah was my teaching assistant, one of my teaching assistants last semester. And in 102, I often, when I get into talking about early modern Europe, and talking about the different kind of political entities and how they don't map onto what we think of as France and Italy and Germany exactly today. Those nations didn't form until much later. I often make the connection to the Game of Thrones world, to A Song of Ice and Fire, because in part because those kind of political dynamics are very much in keeping with the medieval and the early modern world, and also because there are um, the ways in the books, and then we'll talk about in the show, that certain areas, certain families are, and certain regions are discussed. You can draw a lot of parallels to early modern Europe. So I always think of King's Landing as Rome. I've seen it described as London, but I think the fact that it's clearly more, it's a southern climate. They all have like, they wear dresses that show show off their arms. They have hairstyles that are very like, Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, they look very like Greek or archaic to me in the first season, at least, where it's kind
Yeah.
of braided and up top.
yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
Sorry.
and yeah, and I get I can see why a London would work, because it's like it's a capital, it's a port city. But I feel like Rome or somewhere, one of the Italian big cities,
Mhm.
is more what comes to mind for me. Also, because you have the keep, and you basically have the church and the state buildings there at the center of King's Landing, and they're like the major focal point. So it's kind of like Rome, in that the Vatican, which is this religious and political entity, is really at the heart of the city. From what I know, I've never been to Rome though.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. It's always kind of struck me as like a Roman city too.
Mhm.
Especially just like the kind of like dirt roads, like the paved roads, and like the monochrome buildings that are like
Mhm.
in the streets when they're doing those scenes. The first season's so good at that, at like the scenes where they're walking through the city, and you get a lot of like these kind of like setup environment shots.
Mhm.
But I'm definitely with you on it being Rome. It feels like Rome to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. especially Sansa at some point has her hair like this, and there's curls all right here, and that's a very like very Flavian hairstyle for a woman. Uh, but but yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot of Roman things that you could parallel with. Yeah.
yeah. And the shape and kind of many aspects of Westeros, you know, kind of as a geographical entity. I mean, it's basically the British Isles. And I have a map here. So this is another, you know, on the left there is a map that somebody made, a kind of creative take on Westeros, and there you can see, you know, the British Isles there. It's a very similar shape, and that also brings us to one of the historical uh, examples that does kind of make an appearance, and George R. R. Martin has stated that this was kind of his reference point in the Song of Ice and Fire, which is the wall in that context is basically modeled on or in reference to Hadrian's Wall, an ancient Roman structure in you know, in the British Isles. You can see there that sort of pink line, and it is in a very. I should have gotten a better map, but this was kind of a cool map, and I liked it. And you know,
Like it.
the wall is right there. It's just, you know, it's a very similar position, kind of this dividing line, which roughly aligns to the separation between England and Scotland today. It's not exactly right, but that's kind of how you can think about it. And, you know, everyone says, and I would agree with this, that, you know, Winterfell in the north, that's basically Scotland, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because those types of walls were meant to like signal like this is like as far as the empire reaches. And so there is actually a wall that goes farther, the Antonin Wall,
Mhm.
but they never finished it because they got pushed back to the Hadrian's Wall. Um, so yeah, I think it's like a clear and obvious like parallel that it's like
Mhm.
these delineate the edge of the kingdoms or the empires.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I tried to find, it was hard to find a good map that didn't also have the Antonine Wall on it. But I wanted to, you know, because there is only one wall in Westeros, I wanted to include just the one with Hadrian's Wall. But thank you for bringing that up, Hannah. And then the other, so there you go, just some remnants of Hadrian's Wall there on the right. It wasn't quite as tall as the wall, right?
No, no, but there were like oh, what are those called? Like
The kind of like fortifications, right?
yeah, and
Yeah.
like regiments would be set up
Mhm.
at different points along the wall. So like Castle Black has equivalents in
Right.
like real time, and that's where a lot of like so you'll have like Roman villas and stuff found in England, and sometimes it'll be part of a like battalion's camp set up
Hmm.
because it's like the general or whatever would have the villa, and then all the rest of the army would have an encampment type center. So you would have like pockets of communities along the wall to
Hmm.
just fortify it like you would in Castle Black. Though I don't know, I think they're a bit more well upkept than Castle Black or any of the other abandoned
Well,
stuff.
that's kind of one of the things I was gonna say I like about George R. R. Martin's world building, and in part because it's something that is very evident in the world of Tolkien, whom I absolutely love, which is that sense of history and the kind of historical decay that happens with history, and the fact that yeah, there are these different fortifications along the wall in Westeros, but many of them are abandoned and they're ruined because the Watch doesn't have the people to keep them up anymore. But there are a couple like right at either end of the wall, and then Castle Black, like those are the main ones that are still kept up. But they always talk about how they don't have enough people to man even those really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other clear historical reference is in the city of Bravos, which has this towering sculpture that's straddling these two islands and kind of the entrance to the city. And that is definitely, and again, George R. R. Martin has stated that's basically a reference to the Colossus of Rhodes, which, I am familiar with insofar as it was one of the ancient wonders of the world, but I don't know much more about it other than that. So if you two have, if you two have things specifically about this that can help illuminate it, I'd love to hear them.
I mean, I think it's so interesting that like it kind of, when it fell, they saved all the pieces of it and like never actually rebuilt it, or they saved as many pieces as they could and like never rebuilt it. But like, I mean, all of Bravos just kind of really reminds me of Greece when I'm thinking about it. And like, I don't know as much about the Colossus of Rhodes, but like even thinking about the way that like the stairs in Bravos, when there's all those like sweet fight scenes between Arya and the faceless girl.
Yeah. The waif.
But like, yeah, the waif. I couldn't remember her name. But there's all those like scenes going down the stairs and all these scenes like coming into ports, and like I can just imagine like ancient Greece, and like especially in this picture on the right side, like the whole like walk that comes down really reminds me of that whole market area in Bravos, looking at that in that illustration. But
yeah, Bravos and Pentos are cities that I always associate with Greece, in part because they end in OS, which is very, Greek, something you find in the Greek language a lot. Bravos, I always also kind of thought of in relation to a place like Istanbul, because it is a kind of East meets West, multicultural port city. But and there are obviously Greek connections in the ancient medieval world as well.
yeah.
I also just, the Colossus of, this is another instance of what I was talking about with sort of the wall, of that sense of time passing, and the fact that, the sword of the statue of Bravos is broken. And, the Colossus of Rhodes was something that didn't, I don't know, when did it fall?
Like 2nd century.
CE.
I might have been BCE, honestly.
Yeah.
BCE.
I just looked it up because I wanted to, and that says, well, Wikipedia says that the Colossus of Rhodes was in 226 BC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it maintained, you see this illustrations from the 17th century that's, there isn't any representation that I know of from antiquity that shows it, but it was this thing that people knew about and read about, and it was still represented much later. So that sense of like important monuments from history being represented, even if they don't exist anymore, we don't have the best idea of what they look like.
And I love that they like use these kind of devices to like almost like looking at it in Bravos, it almost recreates like a feeling of what was lost, that we don't get from necessarily the illustrations as much, even because it has, I love the way that the cinematography in the show like pans around things and like has these like craning shots when it's coming into things, like even though this is the statue is almost undoubtedly computer animated, like you still get this like atmospheric scene, this atmospheric understanding of like what a colossal statue actually would have felt like.
Yeah, so a lot of well, isn't Bravos the free city? So I guess for when you were talking about Bravos reminding you of Greece, my first thought is there were slaves in Greece, so not so much a free city.
Yeah.
But yeah, and this illustration is really interesting as well, especially this circular port that they have going, because that is something that we have like evidence for in Carthage, in Egypt, I believe. So so it just feels like an amalgamation of a lot of different ancient port cities. Yeah, and because some reconstructions of the Colossus of Rhodes don't have it straddling a
Mm,
port like that, but just kind of like off to the side.
mhm.
But but what do we know?
Yeah.
And yeah, you were talking about the stairs. And I've been to Greece, and there are so many stairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Athens is also like like spans many different hills, kind of
Mhm.
like Rome does. So this Bravos here looks particularly flat, which would more suggest like a Carthage Egypt type thing going on.
Mhm.
Um, but but yeah, they this has a very it looks very Greek, this
Mhm.
Colossus and Bravos, with the circular shield and the pleated skirt thing
Mhm.
going on, and seemingly truncated uh, sword that's like a gladius
Mm,
in Roman times. So um, yeah, and the Colossus of Rhodes is actually of the sun god Helios.
Hmm.
mhm.
So I think it's interesting that the Bravos Colossus is presumably of a warrior or
Mhm.
some soldier, which would make sense if they fought for their freedom to be the free city. Um,
A
so
Nice.
man rather than a deity.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. Solid.
So I just have a number of slides. We're not going to cover every region. These were just kind of ones that um, I pulled up because I thought that there was interesting visual material to talk about, and we can just kind of go through them and see what happens. I mean, so one of the regions that I think in the show there's a very clear relationship to a particular location is the country of Dorne, the capital of which is right. It's Sunspear. That's the capital, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and Dorne was one of those places. I think even reading the books, even before seeing the show, was like, oh, this is Spain. It's clearly a Southern European, more of a hot climate, and there's a lot of talk about Dornish people being, really fiery tempered and kind of it just really smacked to me of reading about it even before seeing the show, smacked to me of like what the stereotypes of around Spanish identity.
Mhm.
um and when you get to the Dornish locations in the show, uh it is very, I mean, this is one of those things where it's kind of hard to be like, oh, we're drawing parallels to history and geography, because it's like it like Doran looks like Spain under rule by the Moors, so under Muslim rule beginning in, what is that, the 9th century,
Hmm.
um, middle in the Middle Ages. And it's because many of the locations were shot in places that were largely constructed in Spain during Moorish rule. So like there is a reason that it looks like Moorish Spain, but it is one that is so visually vibrant to me. It just really sticks out to me. And it's like it is a palace in Spain, in is it in Castile? I can't remember what city it is that the palace where many of these scenes were shot was, but you can draw connections to a place like the Alhambra, um, uh, a massive palatial complex that still exists in Granada, Spain, and it's really through that very vibrant pattern tile work. That's one characteristic of Moorish architecture and decoration that we see in a place like Dorne. A lot of the interspersing of natural and built elements. So the famous water gardens of Dorne is something they talk about in the books. I can't remember if it comes up in the show much, but that courtyard from the Alhambra that you see there on the bottom, in the middle, trees and fountains and stuff kind of blooming within this built environment. Very much that kind of Moorish style architecture from the Middle Ages.
Mhm. Yeah, the like Islamic interweaving and interlocking is something that's very typical and characteristic of that culture. And I think it's an interesting thing to compare and contrast where you have a lot of um this interweaving in the Islamic tradition, but also in like the Celtic and like
Mhm.
Anglo-Saxon and like the cloisonne and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's just an interesting, like clearly it's like a similar visual, but clearly different cultural meaning behind it.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot more art historians are interested in exploring. In the historical record are these moments of and situations of conversation and sort of mutual influence, rather than uh, you know one culture conquering another one and then totally supplanting what happened before. There is that interweaving, as you talk about. Just as a side note, if so we've only got like 10 minutes left technically on the meeting, but I can just start the meeting again. Worst comes to worst, I'll send a new invitation out. If we I mean, I imagine we will run over at this point, but
Yeah.
just so you know.
Cool.
Okay. Because yeah, I saw that and wondered if it was like something that you can just turn off or if it was something that you needed to like re up.
Yeah, I think I'll have to start a new meeting, but as long,
Okay.
I don't have a problem doing that.
I think it's
Um,
interesting to think about the way that like the Spanish stereotypes kind of play a role in the world building here, though.
mhm.
Like using these kind of like stereotypical images where you're um, seeing these kind of like temples that are patterned and mosaicked. They draw you to that place if you've studied art history or if you've encountered a building like this before. They draw you to Spain, they draw you
Yep.
to the Muslim world. But
Mhm.
I think that like I hadn't even thought about like the fiery attitudes of the like people from Dorne and things like that. And I think that the way that the producers have utilized historic spaces to like create this diverse world and like these diverse cultures, um, without necessarily having to fully flesh out who the characters are. Like just these establishing shots when you're introduced to Dorne, you like understand the culture on a deeper level than just seeing it.
Mhm.
And I think that that's one of the strengths of the show for sure, is that they've leveraged these historical sites to build the world and to build a world that has like an effective uh appeal to it.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I don't want to ignore though the fact that, or the problems that come with that as
Oh
well.
yeah, it's problematic.
The Yeah, and I mean, like I said, I agree with you. I think that they use these historical this historical material to great effect, but there is the kind of perpetuation of stereotypes and things that definitely need to be mindful of. And I
Yeah.
think that especially becomes the case, when we go to Essos, when we leave Westeros and go across the sea, where the cities and the locations and the cultures have a lot more obvious connections to um, what we would characterize now problematically as non-Western cultures, and all the negative stereotypes that come with that.
Yeah.
I don't have any images of the Dothraki, but that's just classic primitivism right there, and in all the problematic ways. And it's something that eh, I sort of recognize with a show that's reaching for popular appeal, there's an extent to which that's going to happen no matter what. But it
Mm.
I find it so bothersome, like really deeply troubling, the extent to which these certain things are still signifiers, are still used as signifiers of backwardness, primitive states, lack of enlightened thought or philosophy or anything like that. Like those are still used to the same tropes are used to perpetuate those ideas. And it's something like, I just recently rewatched the movie Avatar, and it reminded me of how much I really, really disliked that movie when I saw it the first time. It's like using all the same tropes that, Edward Said wrote Orientalism in 1970, that was published in 1978. We get it. And yet still these things are happening. And it's just, it's really deeply troubling.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, because these things just build up over time, and they're repeated in different forms of media, like you see these scenes, but like you've also seen the same thing in like Ben-Hur, and you go back and watch old movies like that, and they're recreating those same stereotypes there. They just kind of like subtly evolve. But I mean, even just seeing things, you carry that like meaning comes into it, and you feel it. And I really do feel like they leveraged it as a part of their world building, but it is problematic. Yeah. I've never seen the Ishtar Gate before, and it is very striking in resemblance to Karth. I'm like kind of blown away by this.
Yeah. Well, so for the Dothraki, I've read and seen that that's very heavily like trying to reference like the Huns and like Genghis Khan and all that. And I think it's interesting isn't the right word, but interesting that the like the cultural influence that is the most like Eastern is the one that's most stripped of its like obvious like visual culture, and more so based upon just like the horses and the conquering, like that's like
the nomadism, like
yeah, so that's something to ponder about. But yeah, when I was watching the show and like looking through this PowerPoint, it is pretty striking, like the lengths to which the visuals of Karth and Meereen are basically just like these reconstructions of Mesopotamia. I don't know how I was kind of there's this trap that that people seem to fall into when depicting Mesopotamia, as depicting it as just like sand colored and monochromatic, whereas but like if you see like the Ishtar Gate and everything, it's like they had color and they used it to great effect.
So did the Parthenon. I mean, it's like the Parthenon was garishly colored in its own time.
Yeah, so like even like Josh mentioned earlier about King's Landing being kind of monochromatic and it being an analogy to Rome, it's like Rome was so colored, everything was colored.
Yeah, you're right.
So so I think this show kind of falls into that a little bit, that trap a little bit, but it's like only Dorne gets any type of like significant color, which that's supposed to be like reflective of their tempers or something, like their flamboyancy, maybe. But so I mean, these two pictures side by side, like you see the crenellated like turrets and just like the
archway and
everything is very it's very one for one.
Yep. So I messed up, and we had a second half of a conversation that was not recorded. So we're coming back a few days later to re-record that material. Apologies if we repeat ourselves or miss things that we had talked about before, but let's just get to it. So we talked about the exterior scene of Karth, and Hannah brought up a lot about its relationship to ancient Mesopotamia. And for me, when they discuss Karth in the show, the citizens of Karth, they talk about Karth as like the greatest city that ever was and ever will be. And it really rings in my mind of Babylon, of ancient Babylon, particularly the very lush kind of greenery that is overflowing in the city, and like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of the ancient wonders of the world, as was the Colossus of Rhodes. And you can see that in this interior shot through that gateway, where there's the kind of body of water in the background, and these palms and other other sources of greenery kind of overflowing, falling off of the architecture. And then on the left there is, at the bottom, the left image is that reconstruction of specifically the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and then up above more of a cityscape of Babel with the Tower of Babel in kind of jutting up in the center. And there are a lot of connections to ancient Mesopotamia in Essos, as we've kind of already talked about. And this is a 19th century image that includes a lot of elements that are drawn specifically from ancient Mesopotamian sites like Babylon. We have Hannah here, who is much more familiar with the ancient Mesopotamian context, versus me, who's a 19th century specialist. But one of the things I am interested in is art by people like John Martin, like you see here, who was very familiar with the kind of research and archaeological excavations that were being done for the first time right around that moment, and that were illuminating aspects of the ancient Near East that had not been known before. Okay, I keep getting this. I'm signed out because I'm signed in, I'm sure, on my other computer, but my other computer is like locked. So I'm gonna click OK, and hopefully I won't go away, but if I do, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm still here, right?
Yeah.
Still
Okay.
here.
All right. And I guess, yeah, I know in our previous recorded previous conversation that was not recorded, Hannah, you talked a lot about the ziggurats in Meereen and that we see in the background there of John Martin's image. Could you talk a little bit about that? Unfortunately, sure. Again, because I messed up.
Yeah, sure. So ziggurats in the ancient Mesopotamia were supposed to simulate like mountains and be sacred mountains and be dwelling places of gods. Like where a ziggurat was supposed to be where the god dwelled as they dwelled on earth. So like the placement of it was very much preordained, but they were supposed to be like sacred mountains. So I think it's interesting that the Meereen pyramids are like have that mountain in the background and kind of parallel that shape. But yes, so ziggurats kind of had like a stepped
structure kind of thing.
Structure, yeah, is the right word. Step structure, where the top is where the like where the temple is, where the god dwelled, like their actual, and like closer to the heavens where the gods are, and then the lower levels had like different access points for people. So I think that kind of is also at play in the Meereen pyramids, which at the top is where these like rich people lived. But I also think that the Meereen's pyramids are more pyramidal, like that of ancient Egypt. And there's like, it's like ziggurat, stepped mastaba, and then a complete pyramid. And the Meereen ones kind of fuse them all together in a weird way that only like a fantasy place would. And because there's like that smaller pyramid that looks way more like a stepped mastaba than like a ziggurat. Whereas
that, like, is that this one?
Yeah. The one next to it is like straight up pyramid, and then like vestiges of like a ziggurat where it gets...
It looks like a little like ziggurat like parked on top of a pyramid almost.
Yeah.
And you've got that, I mean, in the background here, what looked to be more like kind of the pyramids of Giza that we associate with Europe versus the Mesopotamian ziggurats.
Yeah. And I think so for ancient Mesopotamia, there was really only one ziggurat per city, because those ziggurats were mainly for like it's like a patron kind, like patron god of a city. Like a city would be built around where a god used to dwell, so it's like this god dwelled here, so there's not going to be like three gods living in one spot. Whereas in Myrine, you don't really have that, like this is one god's place. It's like these are just monumental structures that people live in, so you can have multiple rich people living in one spot, so you can have multiple pyramids going on. And that's kind of what you see here in Myrine, where you have multiple of these huge monumental structures going on.
And I think it's, like you say, I think you made a great point about it being a kind of thing that would exist in a fantasy landscape. And I just want to like clarify for anybody watching this that, I didn't perceive what you were saying as not being consistent with the ancient Near East as like a criticism of Game of Thrones, just saying like, no, that wouldn't happen in ancient Mesopotamia, but this isn't ancient Mesopotamia. It's Essos in this invented world. So it's fine, right?
Well, there's this kind of like element of world building where that
Yeah.
you have to like combine these little elements that have these effective triggers to them to kind of fuse it into the bigger picture of what you want it to be. And so like seeing it with like the ziggurat next to this like pyramid, you're kind of like evoking both of those other structures a little bit. I don't know, like I feel like the show designers on Game of Thrones and like the I mean, I guess it'd be the what the art directors probably that did something like this. But I mean, I feel like they really succeeded in a lot of ways in like fusing these elements that people are like familiar with. They have some association with this like notion of grandeur or this sacred site. Like the gods are with them in these ziggurat structures, and like they're kind of like playing with it though, and like putting I think Hannah talked last time we talked a little bit about like it's the rich people that are living in like the top of these structures here. It's like the gods are with them, and there's this like kind of different notion of going on from what we would have seen in the ancient world, but we're still pulling some of that effective vigor into it.
Yeah, I think it's just a bit more explicit and in like a fantasy world, whereas like in real life you kind of have to toe the line between like I am a human, but I am also want to be treated like a deity, and like not trying to like be that arrogant in a way that your culture doesn't like. So
Unless you just decide you want to.
Yeah, and you don't care, but yeah, so
I think that the idea of deities and their representation and relationship to these architectural spaces is a good way to transition to the next slide. And particularly this image that Hannah included of a relief sculpture from Persepolis. So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure.
Yes.
So
oh wait, sorry, before you start, I also want to clarify, we're recording this on a Saturday morning, so if we're not in like tip-top shape, I am hugely grateful to Joshua and Hannah for agreeing to do the second version on a Saturday. So if you're like, wow, they're really not on track, or really not doing as good of a job, or not as sharp, it's Saturday morning, so give us a break.
Yeah, words are hard on Saturdays.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
So I brought up Ahura Mazda, and because it's like kind of like the state god of the Persians, because for Miriam and Astapor, it's like there seems to just be like one god that's like above all, and they get referred to like that. So in Persia and in like the Persian Empire and stuff like that, they had like a state religion of Zoroastrianism, and the like top god in that was Ahura Mazda, and this god was usually depicted as like having like a solar disk with outstretched wings. And sometimes, and when you got a little bit more extravagant, you would have like a a man atop the solar disk, to kind of emphasize that more human type thing to it. So that's kind of why I brought that up, and how like they would put depictions of their deities on like very public structures. But as for the actual look and of these deities in Miriam and Astapor that you have shown here, I think it's like way similar to this Inanna relief that you have here,
Mhm.
because of this horned kind of like capped dome thing going on.
Mhm.
That was like the main indicator of divinity in Mesopotamia. Like the more horns you had, the more divine you were. So you would have some Naram Sin had a relief of himself, and he was like going towards a sacred mountain, and he had a crown just like this, but it only had like one set of horns. So there's that. And you have like the naked female figure with outstretched wings. I think that's a very one for one for this Ishtari Nana relief that you have here.
Yeah,
Which I
except
think is
in
a really good
Marine, at
example.
least it's a harpy. It's always referred to as like the harpy,
Yeah.
which is a I mean, I'm not at all familiar with Zoroastrianism or, the characteristics of deities in
Mhm.
antiquity, but I get the sense from Game of Thrones that the harpy type of deity is more of a uh, sinister figure, but maybe that's just because of the Sons of the Harpy kind
Mhm.
of, group that comes up in that context. Uh, One thing that I was thinking about while you were talking about the Ahura Mazda image, that linking back to our discussion of the ziggurats and the pyramids, that I think is an interesting way of approaching this also, is that so that kind of winged disc motif that you brought up is not specific to Persepolis. It's something
Mhm.
that you see in the Persian Empire. It's something that you see in Egypt. It's something that you see in uh, again, I don't know the specificities of ancient Mesopotamia. Was it in Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian? Was it in all of those different places as well?
Yeah, they had a lot of winged figures
Yeah,
in that, particularly a solar disk is feels more Egyptian. That's way more characteristic of Egypt, but
yeah.
it's not something that is exclusive to
Yeah,
that.
so I think that's another way that we can think about the merging of these different architectural styles in this fantasy world is actually consistent with the archaeological and the historical record, where these motifs weren't, they traveled and they were used in similar ways and in different ways in very different cultural contexts. I mean, the Persians versus the Assyrians versus the Egyptians, that kind of motif. There are variations across these different, thousands of years and historical contexts, but it is a motif that appears in similar ways in these different moments.
Right. Like, so between like Mesopotamia and Egypt was a very big thriving gift economy.
Mhm.
So it's like people in Egypt were making art for like the people in Mesopotamia and vice versa. So it's like they were very much familiar with the like iconography of each other's religions and how
Mhm.
they could fuse them together to create something that's like shows their friendliness towards each other.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I've just got a few more things to show here. I just there are a couple of images here from this is from the first season when Ned Stark is looking through the different lineages, and to me, looking at both the script form and the images, particularly in that Baratheon image on the bottom, uh, is so strikingly similar, not specifically to medieval manuscripts, but to 19th century medievalizing books like those of the Kelmscott Press, this very prominent, very famous press that part of their goal was to revive in some of the techniques and the style of medieval manuscripts and early printed books. So that style of script and the image, I mean, the Baratheon kind of seal there looks to me more like a print than in actual. It looks like a woodcut or something,
Yeah.
even though that it is meant to look like a drawing. But to me, the style of the drawing looks more like a print than it does an actual drawing, and that makes it more akin to the Kelmscott Press types of books than actual medieval manuscripts, which is interesting. And then the Royce image up above, I just like that because it has actual like Anglo-Saxon runes. And on the left, there's an early publication in that includes some Anglo-Saxon runes. And then our last couple of images are ones that Joshua added from Leonardo and that relate to kind of the military aspects of the show. You want to talk to us about those a little bit?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's really important that the set designers kind of like, or the art directors kind of incorporated elements that are outside of like these settings and these locales, and like even getting into the nitty gritty of like the scorpion crossbow, and like the way that it was assembled and the way that it was introduced in the show. It's this very like dramatic moment. He runs into the thing when the dragons are burning everything, and he like jumps in and the whole thing falls open, and like this whole like theatrical unveiling just really kind of like harkens to Leonardo da Vinci's kind of designs for me. I mean, he worked on like theatrical set designs and things like that too, but he did spend most of his career as like a military engineer. And so I think it's cool that the art directors kind of incorporated this aesthetic. So on the right, this is a Da Vinci design for a giant crossbow, so you can actually see the guy loading a bolt or a spear kind of thing into it here. And then on the left, it's Bronn manning the scorpion. But I mean, the way that they designed the scorpion, it doesn't, like, a lot of times when they unveil like something like a big weapon or something in a fantasy world, like it's like gold and bejeweled, like Joffrey's gaudy crossbow. But this is like very, very rustic and like has this like engineered quality. Like I think we mentioned that it's like almost like a steampunk kind of vibe, like a pre-steampunk.
Yeah, I think that was Hannah's phrase, right?
Yeah,
steampunk without the steam. That was a great.
Yeah, I liked that. I liked that a lot. But I mean, I think that it's cool that they did this. And also beyond that, like, I mean, I would imagine like the Lannisters being in King's Landing, and they're from the southern part of Westeros. And so we've seen how they did the design in Essos to kind of harken back to that. And we can look at the Baratheon engraving and see some kind of like Northern Renaissance influence and in things like that. But here we're like coming into like Southern Italy, and this is like the kind of like machinery they would be building in that region, in this kind of fantasy world.
Right.
But
and you mean
cool.
the connection to Italy, you're drawing that because of Leonardo being based in Italy, basically, right?
Partially, but like, I mean, I think it's important that like regionally, I think that things would have probably carried a similar aesthetic. And I think that they like kind of leveraged the, Leonardo's association with Italy, and took elements like what would have been being built in the southern part of Europe in this time frame, and they took that into consideration when they were designing elements like the scorpion even.
Yeah. And as I said in our previous discussion, I think Leonardo would have been totally on board with the idea of this being used in the context of fighting against dragons.
Absolutely.
He would have loved that.
He has so many little dragons and like random drawings. There's a page of like drawings of cats, and there's just like one little dragon in it for no reason. It makes me really happy.
It's kind of like Manet's drawings of cats. Manet is my favorite artist, and every time I see one of his things of cats, it just makes me love him even that much more.
Oh, they're great.
All right, so our last image here.
And then, yeah, this is a Leonardo sketch for the Battle of Anghiari, which is this like mural that he was going to paint for Piero Soderini, and it like never got completed. We don't have a lot of information about what it actually would have looked like, but this is a sketch from one of Leonardo's journals that like kind of shows these horses facing each other, and you can see at the bottom that there's people off horses fighting. There's corpses on the ground in some places. And it like really just like when the Battle of the Bastards took place, and you get that first shot of Jon Snow kind of standing in the middle of this field, and then when the horses meet on either side of him, it's just this complete moment of chaos. And I think that that's something that I mean, in like Byzantine art, you don't see a lot of battle scenes or anything like that. And that was this kind of like leap for Leonardo, was like horse battle. He wanted to be able to capture the anatomy of the horses, but also like the drama of that scene of these like huge bodies intermingling with human bodies. And I feel like that scene really like captures a lot of chaos in the show. And honestly, every time I've watched it, I've thought back to this drawing, just because I think that it's really hard to capture these like moments of how gory and how brutal ancient battles were. And I feel like Leonardo was probably onto something with the Battle of Anghiari. And if he would have finished it, I bet it would have been incredible. I mean, but I also think about like Delacroix and the Romantics when I'm thinking about these like kind of horse battle scenes. But I feel like the set designers even took into consideration, like the art directors took into consideration how artists would have had to represent this in some elements of the show. And I feel like that scene, that 5-minute shot of just the horses crashing into each other, it's so anxiety provoking and emotional. And yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how even the representation of battle is like constructed in these kind of like fantasy worlds.
Yeah, it would seem like if they were to actually like visually represent this battle in Game of Thrones, it would be more like the medieval structure, where it's like everything is very much, you're like in a line and you're trying to see like things from an area, like you're looking at it from like head on, but you're also like it's constructed from an aerial view. And whereas
you're detached from the actual battle
yeah,
yeah,
it's like a lot of like different perspectives all mashed into one, whereas like but if you get into the actual like meat of it, it's very much more like the chaos and just like things, everything's all mixed together like you would see in like this sketch, or even like the the friezes on some temple structures in like Greece and antiquity, where everything is, yeah, like,
well, except the freeze is in a battle, but anyway.
Like the centaur Amikis. God, that word's hard.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
there are some really good like now that you've mentioned that, I'm thinking back, and like there are some really good battle scenes represented in those reliefs.
yeah, there's one on the Great Altar of Pergamon that is, I think that one's a giant Takami or something like that. I don't know if it's the,
is that the one where it's like this?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, but so it's like huge in scale because it's like right up on like the staircase. So but then you still get those like contorting, like torsion figures that kind of like simulate the chaos of battle. Whereas in like things like press, like printing stuff and like medieval tapestries and all that, it's very people like it's more boxy and a little less fluid.
Yeah, and I think, one last thing that I think is worth pointing out is just we've talked a lot about how kind of the actual the landscape, kind of the visual landscape of the show, we can tie to these historical sources in terms of architecture or props or costuming, things like that. And we haven't even gotten into costumes that much. We've talked about like hairstyles, the Flavian hairstyle and things like that. But I think what Joshua's brought in with these with a sketch like this is the way that there's a potential connection back to the actual composition of images from from certain historical periods. And one thing that I was thinking about when you brought this up and have thought about subsequently is how in the Battle of the Bastards, it might even be a case of this kind of merging of these two different aesthetics, this chaos of battle. And I agree, like it's so anxiety inducing watch. I mean, the Battle of the Bastards episode is so good, but it is so anxiety inducing in part because of the chaos, but also because of the regimented militaristic kind of battle formations. And that is something that does come through more so in the kind of in some of the sources Hannah was talking about, where it is, you see these battle formations, it's very structured, it's very rigid. And I think that kind of thing is often lost in representations of these military conflicts in contemporary TV and movies, where it is this heroic, chaotic, kind of, very, very emotive struggle. You don't always get the kind of formation and regimented actions that you see represented in historical sources. And I think the Battle of the Bastards does both of those things. Like whatever that formation is called, where they're closing in with the, with the shields, like that very rigid and ordered progression series of movements. I mean, that is just as anxiety inducing to me as the chaos of the horses and bodies piling up on top of each other.
Yeah, the like tactical strategies that they were implementing, and and Ramsey's side with all the like the banners of the flayed man and the actual like flayed people on the battlefield. But like you read about stuff like that in ancient history of, like strategies of terror like that.
Yeah. So I think this is a good place to stop. And although when we did our last discussion, I put you more on the spot with a question, but I really liked your responses. So I'm going to ask it again. If you could identify a character from A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones that you most identify with, not necessarily the one that you like the best or who's your favorite, but who do you identify with the most? Hannah, let's start with you.
Sure. So, well, BuzzFeed tells me Jon Snow and House Stark, but given my academic interests and I also love to travel, I kind of more identify with Samwell Tarly because he gets to read books and solve mysteries with books and goes to school, but kind of a bad school. Like he kind of just does grunt work, but yeah, I jive with Samwell.
You mentioned something when you're talking about Samwell about the library, right? The library at the Citadel. Could you say something about that? About like what is it? The chain? Yeah,
where like, well, the like aren't the books changed to the library, so you can't take them out, but then like the whole thing is like he gets the keys and gets to like take them out.
Right.
But then he also like becomes like the I can't remember the actual name for it, but it's basically like the secretary to the commander of the Night's Watch, where it's like he gets to like get in on all the hot goss, but doesn't have to like be the person to actually command anybody. And I'm like, ooh, that's a nice position.
Yeah. And actually, as I'm thinking about it, I realized the chain library reference was something from a Getty video that I recently watched. So two manuscript curators at the Getty did a series of videos related to Game of Thrones, which I watched recently. And I was getting that confused with our previous conversation, but I will link to those in this video. Yeah, so Joshua, how about you?
I mean, I like Tyrion is the one that I always liked, but I definitely think that I identify the most with Sandor Clegane, the Hound. And I like, it's kind of this like, I don't know, he kind of gets it and like he's like, I'll work, but like he doesn't really want to. And he kind of hates everybody he works for, but he also like he's an honorable person. He's just a curmudgeon. And I love the like journey he goes through. Like I love his like personal transformation, and I love like his relationship with Arya, and in the show, the season where he's like working on the church and
Love that. I mean,
becomes
it's so
part of this
sad, but
community,
yeah.
and like I don't know, I feel like I identify with that. Like I'm kind of a surly guy. I'm not always well liked, but you know, I like finding my path and finding the people that fit right with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you initially said that, you said that you've been misunderstood or you're often misunderstood.
Yeah.
Surly and a curmudgeon, those are not words I would associate with you at all. So
Yeah,
that
most people don't get that side of me.
yeah. Well, and I had said that the character I think I identify most with is Cersei, only because she is the one character who doesn't go anywhere. And I'm very much a homebody and would never leave my home. That's the pandemic hasn't been a huge change of pace for me because I don't like to leave my home anyway. And because she's the one character who doesn't go on long journeys except at the very beginning of the show, like I very much identify with that. Yeah, just sit in the castle and drink wine. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm here for it.
Well, thank you both for joining me twice to talk about this stuff. I think it was a really fun conversation, and hope we do it again someday.
Yeah.
It's been great.